Hey, it's Ben back again, just 2 days later. So the other day I was talking about my experience with what they refer to as the Vision Quest, and living among the native people for sometimes. And people use different terms. I mean, they would just say, "Go fast," go up into the mountain to fast, whatever. But anyway, today I want to talk about my apprenticeship. Uh, I was fortunate to have the opportunity to train with one of the last surviving traditional doctors among the Kiowa Tribe, in other words, an actual medicine man, Horace Daukei. And that was a pretty intense experience. There will be a little overlap in the introduction, but um, tend to be very self-conscious of repeating things, so I'll do my best to keep that to an absolute minimum. But anyway, from early childhood, there was this uh, strong fascination or identification with Native American people, and also with other indigenous groups as well. And and then in my adolescence, I started hearing about the accounts of the traditional Native doctors, the medicine men, and I was thinking, at that age, 14, if I ever have the opportunity, then that's what I'm going to do with my life. And so I started saving money um, and putting everything aside. I, by the time I was 17, I got in a car on my own and I hauled ass out of Texas, and I was thinking of heading to Arizona, uh, get into boarding school on the Navajo reservation, but my car died in Oklahoma. And so I ended up living in a community of predominantly Kiowa Indians in southwestern Oklahoma. Also some Kiowa, Apache, Comanche, Cheyennes to the north, and Arapaho and Caddo, Wichita, Delaware, or Lenape to the east. And I just made myself at home. Quite dangerous environment. I mean, there's a lot of violence, heavy drinking, destructive influence, um, but I stayed pretty much as I could. Just spent time with Kiowa elders. Like one of my um, friends, about my age, and he introduced me to his, I guess, biologically his uncle. We just referred to him as his dad because uh, the old man and his wife had taken him to raise. And so this older man, Jack, he began to take me into the peyote meetings. Native people were subjected to genocide. On, um, I mean, part of it was just they didn't have immunity towards the diseases, that were prevalent in Europe and Asia and Africa. Native groups didn't have any domesticated animals other than the dog, and in Central South America, the llama, the alpaca, and a lot of our infectious diseases like smallpox and what I forget which one, syphilis, gonorrhea, whatever, and um, I'm not sure about cholera, but a lot of our infectious diseases are zoonotic in origin, which means they started in animals and then they jumped the species barrier into humans. But native people not having the domesticated animals, they hadn't developed the same kind of immune system like you found in Europe and Asia and Africa, Middle East, whatever. So when Europeans started flooding into the continent, they didn't have the immunity to diseases like smallpox, and so the accounts were just horrifying. Just massive numbers of these people were just dying in droves, and you know, and but then on top of that, you had as more European folks are coming in, and the United States government was forming, and then just sending its army, the cavalry, out, and there were a lot of massacres. I mean, they would just ride into the village and kill everybody, even infants, just and so by the turn of 1900, that previous century, there was, I think, under 1 million Native American people left in the United States. It's pretty sad because I think at the time that Europeans first landed, I think it's probably something like around 40, 45 million. But in any case, but there's different aspects of the genocide. There's something called structural genocide, where you're destroying the culture, the language, and you're forcing a religion on those people. Like the Christian missionaries would say that, well, you people suffered because God's angry at you and He's punishing you, because they had their own what was regarded as pagan beliefs, and children were taken away, put in boarding schools, and shamed for their heritage and all that, and the traditional spiritual practices. Many had to go underground, because there were instances where, like, if they wanted to conduct the Sundance, they were threatened, like, well, the troops will come in and they'll kill you, more of your people. So things had to go, as I said, underground. And around that time, I don't know what was 1890s or 1900, whatever, one of the Comanche chiefs, Quanah Parker, he's actually half white. His mother was a white captive, but was venturing down towards the Texas-Mexican border. And he was introduced to peyote, which is a hallucinogenic cactus. And the Mexican tribes had utilized peyote for centuries as part of their healing ritual or something. But as the legend or story goes, Quanah brought it back up to his own Comanche people, and the Kiowas and Comanches were, like pals, for lack of a better term. And so they shared among each other, and they developed this elaborate ceremony. And a lot of the the native doctors now, they just kind of adapted, and they knew how to work with the spirit of the plant itself, and so it's a very powerful experience for them. There's like they would experience healing within the peyote meetings and gain all kinds of insight and understanding, and that's where they'd go to say their prayers in the teepee. And so again, fast forward, here I show up at 17, and I start going into the peyote meetings, and some people weren't too thrilled. Here's this white kid that shows up, but this elderly man, Jack, and he held a lot of clout among his people, and he just said, "This one is different. Let him come in." And so these other folks deferred to him. And so it's in the peyote meetings where I first met my mentor, Horace. First encounter, he didn't say much. He was pretty silent, which was typical after meetings. But then, was it a year or so later, or it's so much time has passed, I was still in my, I think maybe I was 20 by that point when I saw him. But he was conducting a meeting for the grandson of this elderly man, Jack, and the grandson had some type of blood disorder or something. And I remember that night, it was like being afraid, like that he'd say, "You're white, white people can't come in here." And that's happened to me before. But I was talking with my friend, who was my age, and Horace was talking with his adoptive father, who's across the hallway, and Horace just at one point just stopped, and he just stared at me, and it sent chills through me. And I think he knew something at the time, like, he just had a premonition. But so typically we go into the peyote meetings about, as the sun's going down. And so we go out and you line up around in front of the teepee and you walk around clockwise and then you enter the teepee, you find wherever you're going to sit against the outer part of the teepee wall, on the inside though, I mean. And so I'm thinking like, wow, we're lined up, we're going around. I'm actually in here. He hasn't told me to leave. And that was intense. I mean, that was the first time I got to witness a traditional Native doctor actually treating someone. And, Horace had his patient, I think, if I remember right, he was laying face down towards the front of the teepee. And at one point he takes this piece of live charcoal out of the fire and he puts it into his mouth and he's blowing. You see those sparks just flying out of his mouth, towards that patient. And then after a bit, there's this, like, a lot of these Native doctors possess like all these paranormal gifts and abilities, and some pretty amazing things would happen. And I mean, like, there's this one old Kiowa doctor that had an owl living in the teepee with him, and this, I'm not sure how you say his name, a manti or something like that, but and the owls would alert him as to where the cavalry was, and so they were, the Kiowas were supposedly ready and didn't get, massacred like the Cheyennes and Arapahoes, for instance, where the cavalry just came in and rampaged and through their villages. But anyway, so Horace, as he's treating this young man, and he puts his hands on the ground, this actual mole comes up into his hands, and he sets it on his patient, and somehow it's interacting with him, and it's part of the healing process. And there's some special power or something that, and as the Native people would say, that was part of his medicine. And I'd seen Horace work with the mole subsequently later on, and it was funny sometimes because he would take it with him when he would go to different locations, and he would set it loose and it would go underground, and you'd have somebody in their lawn or whatever, and this mole's making tunnels all over the place, and people are like, oh, it's his medicine, leave it alone. And so but anyway, that night, I know I'm jumping around, Horace actually spoke with me during the meeting. He acknowledged me, and I was like, wow. I was shocked. And I think another year had gone by, and my grades were starting to go down in school, realizing I wasn't doing what I really needed to be doing. And after speaking with some friends, I decided to approach Horace, and was absolutely terrified. He'd say, no, you can't learn these things. You're a white guy. And but now Horace said, what are you doing this weekend? Can you start fasting? So he had me drive down to the Wichita Mountains. I'm sitting in my car 2 days and nights, not eating, not drinking. And I think that was just his way of testing me to see if I was serious. And he had me show up to meet him at a peyote meeting that he was conducting on Sunday. And we spoke for a while. He said, okay, when you finish your semester in college, come on out, to where I'm staying on the Navajo reservation. I didn't have an address or nothing, he's just like, come out and we'll get started. And so a couple of months later, I'm with a couple of friends, our group of friends. Some are heading on to California. We're in this caravan. And I head on up we split up at Santa Fe, and myself and one other were heading up to Shiprock on the Navajo Indian Reservation. And we see a teepee up once we get up there. And so we think, okay, well, spend the night at the teepee. They're conducting a peyote meeting there on the Navajo Reservation. And fortunately, somebody actually knew Horace. And so um, I we went, found his home, um, and the apprenticeship was pretty intense. I should mention, I don't know if it's coming through on the microphone. Hopefully not. I was hoping to find a little break or window between it, but in northern Idaho right now, and damn it, these people are not obsessed with their lawns. They're constantly running their lawnmowers and weed whackers and all that. So it's just um, maddening to try to find a time in the middle of the afternoon or any time when there's daylight. But in any case, um, but right away, I just kind of jumped into it with Horace, and the training was intense. He would take me with him when he would go to work with people. And one of the, I guess, unfortunate realities is that among some tribes, there's also people that abuse power. Um, Navajo tribe is, um, there's a lot of that going on among the Navajos and Pueblos, I think, to a lesser extent, but also prevalent among the Hispanic communities in the Southwest. And so I remember that it was the first time I went out with Horace, and he spread the charcoal out on the ground, and he was like staring into the charcoal, and he began to describe the features of an individual, and the man he was speaking with recognized that person, and Horace said, "Okay, I know what to do." Um, I didn't see him work with that individual, actually do the work, but I did on other occasions. And sometimes he would walk out into people's yards, and the people who were abusing power like that, they would bury fetishes in people's yards where there was some kind of like really destructive power or something that was um, instilled in that fetish. And, he was able to sense where it was at, and you go and dig it out. And um, some of those people actually project um, objects into people's bodies from a distance, and Horace would use suction and extract that. And then when he would work with the people, he would direct that force back towards the attacker. And there is I don't know if it's still in print, but there's a book called Witchcraft in the Southwest that I read as an adolescent. And it was describing like a lot of the sorcery practices that were so common among some of the Southwestern tribes. And but Horace worked with all kinds of things. To this date, I've had the opportunity to see and work with healers from different cultures, and I don't believe I've ever seen anyone who's as powerful as Horace was in his day. Um, when Horace would treat people, and I mean, it's fascinating to watch him. I'm not sure how far he went as far as his primary education in those days. What, 1930s is a lot of Native people didn't go to school very long. I don't know, maybe elementary or junior high school or something. But so he didn't know um, proper anatomical terms or anything. But when he'd work with people, he'd do things like he'd take a black handkerchief, put it over the person's head, and sometimes push in on the carotid arteries. When the person would start to go unconscious, he would read them in an instant. And even though he didn't know the correct anatomical terms, he could describe in great intricate detail what was taking place within the person's body. And then he would tell them, well, here's what I'm going to do, and to facilitate the healing. And people were coming to him with cancer and leukemia, and people who had suffered strokes, and just a whole range of things. And he was just extraordinarily gifted, and so many people, even people that weren't expected to live, recovered as a result of his intervention. Other times he'd have the patient laying down, he'd put that black handkerchief over the person's body, and he's like, as he's blowing with the charcoal, and he's like looking down into the body itself. And X-raying that way. Some people jokingly refer to it as the Kiowa X-ray, but so that was intense, just watching him, assisting him, and treating people. And then pretty quickly he started, the whole process of teaching me. And a lot of these native doctors, as I said before, they possess paranormal gifts or abilities. So he would do things like he would actually take like the end of a feather and he would seed it with a portion of his healing power, and then he would transmit it. Like sometimes he'd be standing in front of me, and he would have that black handkerchief, it'd be holding up, pushing the feather into a crease between his lips, and then you'd hear it just, it sounded, the way I describe it is like a gun, with a silencer or something, and I would feel this intense force hitting me. And he'd have someone standing behind because it would knock me unconscious momentarily. And there are other times where he would do that transmission. He would just shoot it straight down into the top of my head. And as I said before, too, there are times I've been hesitant to share a lot of these experiences because people in our modern day Wonder Bread culture, haven't experienced these sorts of things. But say if you were to travel and, parts of South America, in Peru and Brazil or Indonesia, Malaysia, and there are some of these traditional healers in the Philippines and different parts of the world, and you could witness people doing things that are comparable to this. I saw other things comparable during the time I spent in Sri Lanka too. But so Horace would do that transmission, and then he'd have me fasting for periods of time without food and water out in the desert, southwestern Colorado. And then gradually, Horace had me assisting him as he was working with his own patients. And I remember one of the first times there was a man who was injured when a piece of heavy equipment turned over on him and left him paralyzed from the waist down. And so Horace had me, sometimes what they'd do is they'd make little scratches on the body with slivers of glass or something. And then they'd use like a buffalo horn and then just use that suction, or sometimes directly applying your mouth. But so Horace had me doing that suction, and I was just in absolute shock. The blood clots actually came out of the back of the guy's leg, and they were kind of gelatinous. And Horace took a toothpick and he was kind of like, I don't know, moving them a bit or examining it or them. And again, I was just like, holy shit, this actually worked. It happened. But I was still very, very hesitant to begin to work on my own. I was thinking like, well, do I even know what I'm doing? Or what if I hurt somebody? And Horace was calmly insistent and just said, you got it. I've transmitted a portion of this healing power to you, and you just need to start working with people. And he said, I can't tell you everything you need to do. You just got to start working with people, and it's going to reveal itself to you. So, but it still took me quite some time to get to working on my own. There were many aspects to my experience with Horace, and I'll see if I can remember everything. I remember when I first came out, and I gave Horace a pretty good chunk of cash, which in hindsight, I think that was a bargain. It was worth far more than I ever gave him. But Horace, we traveled around a lot. He was living in the Four Corners area where New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Colorado meet. And on the Navajo reservation, but we'd make these road trips back and forth to Oklahoma. And for some reason, he liked to go to Nevada a lot too. But uh, we were in this casino in Las Vegas, and he blew like a huge amount of money in the casino. And I thought I'd made the worst mistake of my lifetime or something. And, all that money just gone. And in those days, that was a lot of money. And he gave me what appeared to be his last $10 bill. And he said, go get tokens. And I was, by that point, livid. I wanted to fucking kill him. And, but I shoved the bucket into his hands, and he calmly handed it back to me and said, just follow me. And so he said, put a token in, and he pulled a handle, and it paid. And like about 10 slot machines in a row paid. And all of a sudden we have this bucket, filling up with tokens. And it's like, let's keep going. He said, no, it's getting late. Let's go up and get some sleep for the night. We were staying there in one of the casinos. There's another time though, because he could tell when those slot machines are going to pay out. And he looks like this worn out old Indian, and, casino employees, they're not thinking anything of it. He's this old native guy sitting there playing the slot machines. And, at one point, this machine hit the jackpot, and all of these like tokens are coming out. And because his son Junior was there at the time and was just laughing because it's like there's one of those machines with the siren on the top, casino employees coming from different directions, and it just has this kind of sheepish expression on his face. And but there are people that claim to be psychic, and I often just say, no, don't tell me. I don't want to hear it, because usually they're wrong. And I just say, I have enough confusion in my life. Don't add to it. I've never seen anybody as psychic as Horace. Times I'd be riding with him, and it would be going cross country, and much of the time he would go for hours and not say a word. But sometimes he'd start describing things that had happened at different points in my life. And it's as though you were watching a movie. You couldn't hide anything from him. I mentioned in the Vision Quest video where he said getting into an argument with him. And it was kind of maddening, because before I could get the words out of my mouth, he would rebut my argument. I'd see him do that with his wife sometime, and she'd be blowing a gasket. So, and he seemed impervious to it. But yeah, it was extraordinarily gifted in that way. And the training was intense. There was like I said, at times he'd be transmitting portions of his own healing gifts to me and having me fast. But he also wanted me to know how to survive and to rely upon my instincts. And so at one point, he dumped me out in the middle of the Hopi Indian reservation in central Arizona, and with $30 in my backpack, and his instructions were to hitchhike to Las Vegas, Nevada. And he said, as he drove off, he just said, make it the best you can. And, and let me know where you're at too, when you get situated. And that was intense. I get into Vegas, and there's like middle of winter, and there's all the homeless people come down out of the north. There were like inordinate numbers of them. And, I just, having grown up in a Christian evangelical, I just thought, okay, I'll start calling churches and see what I can do. And I got put up in a boarding house, and after a while found work. And a couple months later, Horace shows up, come in and check on me. And then a few months after that, he came back, and it's like, ready to go. And we were back on the road again. And Horace primarily worked as a conduit, which the really gifted healers, they allow other forces or beings to work through them. And sometimes he incorporated medicinal plants, um, but he had this amazing ability where he could tune into the plant and tell what its medicinal properties were, and he could somehow work with the spirit of the plant to potentize it so that it was that much more powerful. And I remember one point driving out through Nevada, and he just says, "Pull over." And he tells me to walk in a certain direction. He describes the plant with certain kind of features. And so I walk out in that direction, and he told me to gather a handful. I bring him back, and I said, "Is this what you wanted?" And he just um, put him in his briefcase, and we headed on down the road. And there'd be these like really unusual, kind of amazing experiences that would happen being with him. And one time, in the middle of Santa Fe, New Mexico, driving into the College of Santa Fe, and an eagle swoops down. I know Santa Fe is not that big of a town, but still, I wouldn't expect it there. But in Nevada, on one of these back roads, and at one point there's this eagle devouring its prey, and it's just like mere feet from the van, and stops, opens the door of the van. The eagle just looks up and, staring at us a minute or seconds, whatever, and then just goes back and devouring its prey. But I think because he possessed that power, that eagle medicine, that, the eagles would come around him and stuff. And so, as I said, a lot of extraordinary experiences. Horace, like everyone else, is human, had his contradictions. He could be an incredible hard ass. When his father had transmitted, his father, Waldo Daukei, there's Waldo, who was Horace's son, named after the father, but there was Horace's father, Waldo, was also known to be an extraordinarily powerful doctor. So Horace's father had transmitted healing power to Horace, those healing gifts. And then Horace was shipped off to Europe during World War II. And even, during the time that I knew him there, during my apprenticeship, he still had pieces of shrapnel in his back from German artillery. And I think one of the things that I really regret, though, is there's so many things I never thought to ask Horace, and which I have, in all these years that had passed. But I didn't at that time. And, about his own family background, and, just to understand more about, these healing gifts, and, the history, everything, but, and again, Horace wasn't that, all that verbose. He was quiet. He had a very black sense of humor, and he could make people laugh at times. It was silly at times, but often very quiet. I'm allergic to bee stings, bee and wasp and all that. And at one point, my wrist was all swollen up from having been stung. And, we had just come out of the sweat lodge, and he put his hand on my wrist, and the swelling goes down in my wrist, and goes down to normal. And then the swelling, his wrist started puffing up. He took that swelling into his wrist, and then, I don't know, 30 minutes or so, he dissipated that and let it go. But usually, I've had to go to doctors before, and, the swelling would persist for days. It went pretty quickly. Within a few minutes' time, he pulled it out of my wrist. Horace liked to doctor in the sweat lodge, and I've seen him do things like where some guy would go in with a big, like leg infected, open wound, draining, whatever, and you'd work with the guy, and I saw the first installment where like the guy's leg had gone down a great deal, and the wound had partially closed. He was going to continue to work with him over the coming days. I didn't get to see the other part. Um, Horace definitely wanted to toughen me up. Um, I, I think he was just constantly putting me through stuff. I think his thinking was like, hey, white guy, how bad do you want this gift? How bad do you want this? And so I don't know, maybe part of his background or what, but you know, he was constantly taking me in the sweat. And when he had me fasting, sometimes like 4 and 5 times during the day, and he was just absolutely cooking me. And he would get it so excruciatingly hot. And then you can't stand upright in sweat. Sweat is, for those who don't know, they would take usually willow saplings, and they would dig little holes and put the wider end down into the hole and cover it with dirt, and then they would bend them over and tie them, and then you'd have support, like other little saplings tied around. And traditionally they covered it with buffalo hides, but then they use blankets, tarps, whatever they can get. And then they dig a hole in the middle, and they'd heat rocks, and Horace primarily liked to use the lava rocks, that you found in New Mexico, like between Albuquerque and the Texas border, somewhere in there. I think I forget which side, towards the Texas side or heading towards Gallup, somewhere in there, you got the lava rocks. But in any case, Horace was able to, he would pick up those rocks, and he was working with that power, and those rocks are extraordinarily hot, and sometimes he would he had that buffalo medicine too, and you would just feel that presence of the buffalo come into the sweat lodge, and feel like you're this again, this extraordinarily powerful presence. But yeah, as I said, Horace would be wanting to toughen me up, so he just got it as excruciatingly hot as you could imagine it, and you can't stand upright in the lodge, but he would have me standing so my back was up to the top, and all the heat's going up to the top, and he says, "Say something so I know you're up here," and it was so scorchingly hot that all I could do was squeak, and he'd make fun of me, emulate that squeaking sound I made. But other times it would be in the sweat lodge, where other people would come in. And I remember one afternoon, this woman was crying because she said it was so hot she couldn't breathe. And I'm thinking, God, man, this is barely lukewarm compared to what he puts me through. But back to what I was saying about, everyone has everyone's human, everyone has their contradictions. A lot of Native people, there's that kind of biological predisposition, as other Indigenous groups as well, that have not been exposed to alcohol, like Europeans, and, just millennia, just drinking and developed this tolerance, but Native Americans never developed that. So Horace actually stayed abstained vast majority of times, or majority of the time, but here and there he would go on binges, which was pretty scary because it was like felt pretty destructive when that was happening. And then as I said again, Horace was the most extraordinarily powerful, gifted healer I'd ever encountered. But As in so many different spiritual traditions, whether it's, in India, the Hindu Vedic tradition, the gurus, and you see in more recent decades, there are all these crazy scandals going on, and abuses of power, and um, yeah, among Sufis, which is the mystical sect of Islam, the Buddhist monks, and other spiritual traditions. It's quite common, and I think a big part of it is like in all these traditions, there just wasn't the understanding of how to deal with the emotional component. And so what happens is when you possess such extraordinary power, the power itself is impartial in that it's going to filter through your psyche. And so if you're carrying all this emotional wounding, all these unresolved conflicted issues, that power is going to filter through it. And so um, during the latter stages of my apprentice, during the latter part of those 3 years, then I could see Horace was becoming a bit destructive, and sometimes it was like being in day and night at the same time, because there's a string of miracles on one hand, and then there is like the chaos on the other, and even some of his own people were becoming a bit fearful of him, avoiding him at that point. Um, I've spoken with a number of the Kiowa elders back who were around at that time, and we had conversations, and some of them told me that they had confronted him, and even another man that I'd spoken with, who's still alive, that a few years back, that they didn't feel they could really reach him at that point. They tried to kind of straighten him out a bit, but he was, there was a recklessness, and then there's, I'm forgetting his name. Um, there's another native doctor who was somewhere, maybe around the Santa Fe or slightly north somewhere, who worked with Horace and also, tried to get Horace kind of back on track. So during that stage, it's Horace. I think a good bit of that power left him, and I was getting afraid myself, and so not knowing what to do at that point, I just broke contact, and which was extraordinarily painful. I was very disillusioned. Horace, I would say, is probably the closest thing I would ever have to a father figure. There was a love there. It was mutual. And despite the fact that he was so harsh, which I think that was just part of the training, I think he genuinely did care about me, and I did for him. But I was afraid of what was happening at the time. I have since spoken with some of his family members, and they said that some of that came back. And one, I don't know, he refers to Horace as his grandfather, but he was telling me, I mentioned earlier, how psychic Horace was, and accounts of people would show up at the house, and before the person could even knock on the door, Horace would say, "Oh, go get the door. So and so is here," and they'd like look at him and said, "No, go. He's here." And then all of a sudden, there's a knock on the door, and that person is. So apparently, he's getting some of it back, and he was doctoring again. And even there's this woman that Horace was seeing for a while that was. And she told me that they were driving through Nevada, and said that as they're cruising down the road, and Horace says, Rolling Thunder lives over there. Rolling Thunder is this Cherokee medicine man who lived a few decades back. And And someone said, "Well, why didn't you stop?" And Horace said, "He's not home." He says, "Well, how do you know?" And so he did a U-turn, back up the highway, up the driveway. So go knock and knock on his door. Ask for Rolling Thunder. She did, and said, "Oh no, he's not here." But so yeah, like I said, there's so many different aspects to my experience, and I was with him, and it was very amazing all that happened, during this couple of years. And again, like, you know, I would have never wanted to break from him. It's like my hope was that, I would stay with him indefinitely and continue to train and all that. But when he went through that destructive stage, then I found myself on my own. Got back into college, spent a few years putting my head back together after all that intensity, and then I gradually started working with people, and then around the time I turned 31, I started going to do the Vision Quest on my own. And I saw him, from a distance, when I was back in Oklahoma on a couple occasions, but I was still a bit scared because I didn't know quite for sure where he was at that point. But and at one point when I was on the mountain, the friend who was helping to facilitate, by letting me stay at his home and drive me down to the mountain, coming to check on me. So I was actually on a Vision Quest, and the friend Harry told me that Horace had passed away, and I've heard conflicting accounts. I don't know exactly what transpired. Sometimes it's hard to know. Out on the Navajo reservation, it's like a lot of developing nations. But yeah, I had a lot of uncertainty. I didn't know that I really possessed any gifts or capacities, but gradually people started asking me if I'd share with them what I'd gone through over the past few years, and people would ask, "Well, can you help me with this or that or whatever?" And it's like, I guess I'll try. And then people were sharing with me these accounts of or their experience of feeling this like just intensely powerful force descend into the room, and feeling like other forces or beings working through me to facilitate the healing of whatever it is that whatever condition that they were dealing with at the time. So gradually my confidence started to build, and I never found anyone else that I could apprentice with, that I could continue my training with. But I just relied upon the Vision Quest, where I go out the 4 days and nights to fast without food and water, which I've gone dozens of times over the years now. But I think I pretty much remembered everything I wanted to include, even if I wasn't in a logical sequential order. So if you have questions, you could always reach out to me. And but I'll leave you with that. Bye for now.